Do we have prophets today?
I'll make my own decisions. What a stupid thing to say. Lord, I need you every day.
That depends on what you mean by prophet and how you define prophecy. This is going to take a mini-series to unpack. Let's see what Logos says about prophecy. Although the word prophecy often evokes images of people who predict the future, Hebrew prophets primarily anticipated the punishment of evil and/or a better life on earth for faithful Israelites. They spoke the truth about the present and what would happen if people did not change their behavior and return to Yahweh's ways. When Hebrew prophets did focus on the future, they were usually concerned with the short-term future. For example, they predicted the fall of Israel or Judah, or the end of the Babylonian or Assyrian empires, events that ultimately fulfilled God's intentions or righteousness. At times, prophecies also concerned events far into the future. For instance, Old Testament prophecies do not reference Jesus by name, but they do speak about what a future Messiah or suffering servant would accomplish. The New Testament writers interpreted Old Testament texts as predictions of Jesus' birth, career, death, and resurrection. Some events spoken of in biblical prophetic works have yet to occur, as with the New Testament promises of Jesus' return in Revelation. While the biblical prophets were primarily concerned with their original audience, their writings offer modern readers insight into God's will and divine justice. I've been told this one before. Well, you don't believe in prophets, Nikki, because you're a cessationist. Actually, no, I'm really not. I just don't define prophet or prophecy the way culture does. I have encountered many people in my personal life who are misinterpreting the word prophet. There is much cultural confusion going on around the word prophet and the word prophecy. Culture seems to see it more as fortune telling or getting new revelation from God. And I do believe that people are getting sensationalism mixed up with these spiritual gifts. And that lines up more with the Greco-Roman view. Let's go to Logos. In classical Greece, the word prophet, prophetes, had three different meanings. A religious office, preeminently the oracle at Delphi. The activity associated with the oracle was not considered ecstatic or frenzied. Proclamations were intelligible, though frequently obscure. This form of prophecy was verbal, not visionary, and the interpretation of her words was difficult and often subjective. People who received and proclaimed an oracle from the gods outside of the temples. In such cases, the emphasis is on the proclamation rather than the inspired reception. Any official spokesperson, be he speaking on behalf of gods, muses, or others. These uses continued into the Hellenistic era, and the term was further expanded to refer to high-ranking Egyptian priests. In this period, the translators of the Septuagint also used the word prophetes for the Hebrew nabi. In both classical and Hellenistic Greece, prophets were primarily spokespeople, not inspired persons, a term that focuses on the reception of the divine messages. Greco-Roman prophets were people who communicated a divine message. The notion of mantic or ecstatic inspiration leading up to the communication of that message is absent. Indeed, the prophet did not have to be the recipient of the message at all. For Plato, Mantis received a message, and a prophetes proclaimed it. Greco-Roman prophecy could take the form of spontaneous dreams, dreams at an official religious site, visions, and technical divination such as reading entrails or casting lots. Verbal content could be archaic prose, such as was used by the oracle at Delphi, or even poetry, like the Sibylline books that were written in Greek hexameter. The latter were oracles delivered by a priestess, called a sibyl, at specific shrines and written down in Greek verse for imperial rulers. Traditionally, Christian prophecy has been distinguished from Greco-Roman prophecy by the belief that Greco-Roman prophecy was frenzied, induced either by drugs or natural phenomena like vapors, and morally neutral in its predictive aspects. However, Forbes argues that the first two accusations have no foundation in the written record. With respect to the moral neutrality of Greco-Roman prophecy, Aoun argues that the lack of religious or moral interest is due to a differing social role for the prophet in Greco-Roman society. See this book. Many Greco-Roman oracles were concerned with the regulation of religious practice, as was true of prophets in the ancient Near Eastern tradition. The greatest differences between Greco-Roman prophecy and the early Christian church are that in the former, prophecy came predominantly in the form of technical divination and answers to specific questions brought up by supplicants. Moreover, Greco-Roman prophecy was mostly institutionalized in temples and shrines and was limited to specific individuals within the hierarchy. So, more like fortune-telling and divination. But is that scriptural? Let's take a gander at the prophets of the Old Testament, aka the Law and Prophets, to dive into their circumstances and what was going on around them. We have 16 of them to work with, 12 major prophets and 4 minor prophets. I say 4 major prophets because we're going to lump Lamentations and Jeremiah into the same prophet, because that's probably who wrote Lamentations. Side note, major and minor prophets just means that they're bigger chunks of writing. The major prophets were bigger chunks of writing. The minor prophets were smaller. This is not a reference to relevance whatsoever. All right, we see 4 types of prophets in the Old Testament. The early prophets, pre-exilic, exilic, and post-exilic. And by exilic, I mean when they were in exile. The Hebrew word for prophet is nabi. A nabi was a spokesman, a speaker, a prophet. I like the way that the GCBI instructor, Dr. Randall D. Smith, words it. He says, when you think of a prophet, think of God's view of the news. And it also doesn't have to be necessarily about the future. The early prophets were Joshua, Judges, the Samuels, the Kings, and the Chronicles. 1 Chronicles 29:29 says this. King David's accomplishments from start to finish are recorded in the annals of Samuel the prophet, the annals of Nathan the prophet, and the annals of Gad the prophet. So we know where these books came from. Joshua was written as a military account of what God had told Moses to tell the Israelites to do. And this book was most likely written by Joshua himself. I understand that we don't write our own eulogies, so obviously that part was added by a later prophet. The other 3 types of prophets are the ones that most people are referring to. These prophets mainly warned of God's boundaries being crossed and the results that would happen if they continued in their rebellion. And throughout the books of the early prophets, Sam, Nate, and Gad documented many of these prophets. The common thread was repent, as in change your mind, change your ways, and God will have compassion. The pre-exilic prophets included Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Jeremiah, who was also exilic. These prophets preserved ancient religious traditions, reinterpreted them to bring about controlled social change, and delivered oracles against Israel's enemies. Little is known about their personal lives or behavior, as the emphasis falls on their messages. They were neither ecstatic nor frenzied, nor were they particularly prone to visions, except Jeremiah. Exilic and post-exilic prophets. With the fall of the Davidic monarchy, aka the divided kingdom period, in 520 BC, the classical model of Israelite prophecy fell as well. Prophecy came to be seen as either prerogative of a specific inspired individual or as a generalized spirit available to the entire religious community. Post-exilic prophecy developed a distinctly forward-looking momentum, one that was no longer concerned with the past or even the socio-political present, but with Yahweh's promised eschatological restoration and final theophany. The prophetic books of the exilic and post-exilic periods include Obadiah, written after the fall of Jerusalem. Obadiah delivered oracles against Edom, a neighboring nation who helped the Babylonians plunder Israel in the 6th century BC. Haggai and Zechariah, prophecies concerning the temple reconstruction in 520 BC. Ezekiel, exclusively concerned with the exilic community as it prepared for promised restoration. Jeremiah, whose exilic portions show similar themes to Ezekiel's. The exile as punishment for sins, a warning to accept it with humility, and restoration at the end of the appointed period. Joel, which cites many earlier prophetic works and is concerned with the restoration of Israel and Yahweh's kingdom. Malachi, who focuses on corrupt religious practices and offers a harsh criticism of the temple establishment. Exilic and post-exilic prophecy contains more references to visions than pre-exilic. Obadiah, Zechariah, and Ezekiel are said to have received messages in visions. Wilson notes that while exilic prophecy focused on predicting the coming restoration of Israel and denouncing Israel's enemies, post-exilic prophecy hints at the existence of competing factions within the Israelite community and may have had a polemical intent. What on earth is polemical? Polemical is expressing or constituting a strongly critical attack on or controversial opinion about someone or something. So let's talk about the major prophets first. Ezekiel 2 says this. He said to me, "Son of man, I am sending you to the house of Israel, to rebellious nations who have rebelled against me. Both they and their fathers have revolted against me to this very day. The people to whom I am sending you are obstinate and hard-hearted, and you must say to them, 'This is what the sovereign Lord says,' and as for them, whether they listen or not, for they are a rebellious house, they will know that a prophet has been among them. But you, son of man, do not fear them, and do not fear their words, even though briars and thorns surround you, and you live among scorpions. Do not fear their words, and do not be terrified of the looks they give you, for they are a rebellious house. You must speak my words to them, whether they listen or not, for they are rebellious." Prophets were definitely unpopular for their messages, and often they were imprisoned, beaten, starved, put in cisterns, and all kinds of weird stuff for what they were saying. People didn't like it. And God often used the prophets as a visual example to get through to Israel the seriousness of their situation and rebelliousness. like Jeremiah's loincloth or the breaking of the pottery. And in Hosea's case, he actually lived out an enactment of Israel's adultery against God. Ezekiel, one of the exilic prophets, was told to lay on his side for 390 days and then flip over to the other side for another 40. And then he was told to cook his food over human dung. And righteous Daniel was thrown into a pit of lions for his belief. Actually, Daniel and his friends regularly lived life and death situations because they feared God and followed God, and people didn't like what they had to say or the things that they did. Jeremiah, one of the exilic prophets, records this. But you, Jeremiah, get yourself ready. Go and tell these people everything I instruct you to say. Do not be afraid of them, or I will give you good reason to be terrified of them. I, the Lord, hereby promise to make you as strong as a fortified city, an iron pillar and a bronze wall. You will be able to stand up against all who live in the land, including the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and all the people of the land. They will attack you, but they will not be able to overcome you, for I will be with you to rescue you, says the Lord. And Isaiah's message was, God is sovereign, and He is in control. Not to mention, He hates pride, but loves the humble. Isaiah also foretold of the coming Messiah who would pay the penalty of sin for our wicked world. And Jewish tradition tells us that he died a horrible death. A tree was hollowed out, he was stuffed into it, and sawn in half. But then many of the prophets were martyred because they were speaking on God's behalf, and people didn't like what they had to say. Yeah, this is a big topic. And since it's such a big topic, we're going to continue on Monday. And as always, thank you so much for being here today. Make sure to hit the subscribe right there if you haven't already, and click the bell for notifications. And if you would, hit that like button for me. And I will see you next time. Maranatha.
So let His love shine through in everything we do. It's all for love.